I've always believed that the most unsettling horrors are those that creep into the mundane corners of our lives, turning the familiar into something twisted and unrecognizable. What I'm about to share is not a work of fiction. It is a true account of events that unfolded in my life, events that have left an indelible mark on my psyche. I recount them here not for catharsis, but as a warning. It began in the autumn of 2019. I had recently moved into a modest, two-bedroom house nestled in the outskirts of a quiet town in Yorkshire. The house was unremarkable, a relic from the 1970s with faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards. Yet, it had a certain charm, a promise of solitude that I found appealing after the cacophony of city life. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, arranging furniture, and acquainting myself with the local community. The neighbors were polite but distant, offering courteous nods and brief pleasantries. It suited me fine. I wasn't looking for companionship. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the living room, I settled into my armchair with a book. The house was enveloped in a comforting silence, save for the occasional creak of the settling structure. It was then that I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against fabric. I paused, listening intently. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, and seemed to emanate from the corner of the room where an old curtain hung over a small window. The window was closed, and there was no draft. Dismissing it as the house adjusting to the cooling night, I returned to my book. But the rustling persisted. Over the next few days, the sound became more pronounced. At first, it occurred only in the evenings, a gentle whisper of cloth against cloth. I checked the windows, the vents, even the attic, searching for the source. Nothing. There was no logical explanation for the noise. Then it began to escalate. One night, as I lay in bed, the rustling grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to move, drifting from the living room to the hallway, then pausing outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable, fabric shifting, sliding, as if someone were dragging a heavy cloth along the walls. Summoning courage, I threw off the covers and opened the door. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the windows. The rustling had ceased, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing down on me, before retreating to the safety of my bed. Sleep eluded me that night. Determined to uncover the source, I set up a digital recorder in the living room the following evening. If there was a rational explanation, I was going to find it. I left the device running overnight, hoping to capture the elusive sound. The next morning, I played back the recording. For the first few hours, there was nothing but the ambient sounds of the house. Then, around 2:47 a.m., the rustling began. It started softly, then grew louder, more agitated. But there was something else, a faint whispering, barely audible beneath the rustling. I strained to decipher the words, but they were unintelligible, a hushed susurration that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was in the house. I reached out to the previous owner, a woman named Margaret, who had lived there for over 3 decades before moving to a care home. When I mentioned the rustling, there was a long pause. "You've heard it, then," she said finally, her voice tinged with resignation. "What is it?" I asked, a sense of dread creeping over me. I don't know, she admitted. It started after my husband passed away. I thought I was imagining things, but it never went away. I stopped using the living room altogether. Her words offered no comfort. That night, I decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbance. Armed with a flashlight and a newfound resolve, I sat in the living room, waiting. The hours ticked by, the silence stretching thin. Then, as the clock struck 3, the rustling began. I turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The curtain fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. I approached it cautiously, reaching out to pull it aside. As my fingers brushed the fabric, a sudden chill enveloped me, and the rustling ceased. But the silence was short-lived. From behind me came a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The room was empty. Yet, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, a prickling awareness that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I didn't sleep that night. Over the following weeks, the occurrences intensified. Objects would be moved from their places, doors would creak open on their own, and the rustling became a nightly torment. I was unraveling, my grip on reality slipping with each passing day. Desperation led me to seek help from a local historian, Mr. Ellis, who had an extensive knowledge of the town's past. When I described my experiences, his expression grew grave. There's a legend, he began, about a weaver who lived on that property in the late 1800s. They say he was obsessed with his craft, working tirelessly to create the perfect cloth. One night, during a terrible storm, he vanished without a trace. All that was found was his loom and yards of unfinished fabric. I listened, the pieces falling into place. They say his spirit lingers, Mr. Ellis continued, still trying to complete his work. The rustling you hear, it could be the sound of his cloth, moving without wind. The revelation was both a relief and a new source of terror. At least I wasn't losing my mind. But how does one deal with a restless spirit? I decided to confront it directly. That night, as the rustling began, I spoke aloud. I know your story, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coiling in my gut. I know about your work, your passion, but you're scaring me. Please find peace. The rustling paused, the silence stretching taut. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a gust of wind, impossible as all the windows were shut, swept through the room, and the curtain billowed violently. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The house fell silent. In the days that followed, the disturbances ceased. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I felt a sense of normalcy return. Yet every so often in the quiet moments just before sleep claims me, I think I hear it, a faint rustling like cloth moving with no wind. And I wonder if he's still there, weaving his endless tapestry in the shadows. In the days following my attempt to address the restless spirit, the house settled into an uneasy calm. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the rustling ceased. I dared to believe that my words had reached the weaver's lingering essence, granting him the peace he sought. However, the reprieve was short-lived. A week later, on a particularly cold and overcast evening, I returned home to find the living room window ajar. I was certain I had closed it before leaving that morning. A chill breeze whispered through the gap, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth, and something else, something musty and decayed. Unease prickled at the edges of my consciousness, but I dismissed it attributing the open window to a lapse in memory. As night fell, I settled into my armchair with a cup of tea, attempting to lose myself in a novel. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as they adjusted to the dropping temperature. Then, just as I began to relax, a familiar sound reached my ears, the soft rustling of fabric. My heart sank. The noise was faint at first, like the gentle swaying of curtains in a breeze, but it gradually grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to emanate from the corner of the room where the old curtain hung over the small window. I set my book aside and approached the window cautiously. The curtain was still, unmoving. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before pulling it aside. The window was closed and locked. Perplexed, I let the curtain fall back into place and turned away. As I did, the rustling resumed, louder this time, as if whatever was causing it was growing agitated. Determined to find a rational explanation, I scoured the room for any possible sources of the sound. I checked the vents, the fireplace, even the walls for signs of rodents. Nothing. The house was old, yes, but it was structurally sound. There was no logical reason for the persistent rustling. Sleep was elusive that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the rustling would begin anew, a maddening whisper that seemed to seep into my very bones. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted both physically and mentally. Over the next few days, the disturbances intensified. The rustling became a constant presence, following me from room to room. Objects began to move on their own, subtle at first, a book out of place, a chair slightly askew. But soon it escalated. One evening, I returned home to find the dining table overturned, its contents strewn across the floor. Panic gripped me as I surveyed the chaos. Someone had to have broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was missing. It was as if a whirlwind had torn through the room, leaving destruction in its wake. Desperation led me to seek out a local medium, a woman named Evelyn who came highly recommended by a neighbor. Evelyn was an older woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight into your soul. When I explained the situation, she listened intently, nodding occasionally. After I finished, she reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "There's a presence in your home," she said softly. "A restless spirit tied to something within the house. We need to find the anchor and sever the connection." Evelyn agreed to visit the house that evening. As we entered, the atmosphere grew heavy, the air thick with an unspoken tension. She moved through the rooms with a quiet confidence, pausing occasionally as if listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. When we reached the living room, she stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on the old curtain. "There," she whispered. "That's where the energy is strongest." I watched as she approached the curtain, her hands outstretched. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The room grew colder, and the rustling began anew, louder and more frantic than ever before. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, and she turned to me. "We need to find whatever is hidden behind this curtain," she said urgently. Together, we removed the curtain rod from its brackets, letting the heavy fabric fall to the floor. Behind it, the wall was unremarkable, save for a small, almost imperceptible seam running vertically along the plaster. Evelyn traced the seam with her fingers, pressing gently. With a soft click, a hidden panel sprung open, revealing a narrow compartment within the wall. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was an old, ornately carved spindle. The wood was dark and polished, the carvings intricate and mesmerizing. Evelyn carefully lifted it from its hiding place, her expression somber. "This," she said, "is the anchor. The weaver's spirit is bound to this object." I stared at the spindle, a mix of awe and fear coursing through me. One of the days following Evelyn's visit and the discovery of the spindle, a deceptive calm settled over the house. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to have lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of peace. I dared to believe that perhaps the worst was behind me. Yet, beneath this fragile tranquility, an undercurrent of unease persisted, like the faintest whisper of a storm gathering on the horizon. The spindle now rested on the mantelpiece, a silent sentinel overseeing the living room. Its dark wood gleamed dully in the dim light, the intricate carvings casting subtle shadows that danced across the wall. Despite Evelyn's assurance that removing it had severed the spirit's anchor, I couldn't shake the feeling that it still held some residual energy, a lingering echo of its former owner's obsession. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, I found myself drawn to the spindle. An inexplicable compulsion urged me to examine it more closely, to run my fingers over the elaborate patterns etched into its surface. As I did, a shiver coursed through me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I heard a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against fabric. I froze, heart pounding, but the house remained silent. Shaking off the sensation, I placed the spindle back on the mantel and retreated to the kitchen, determined to distract myself with the mundane task of preparing dinner. That night, sleep was elusive. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with fragmented thoughts and half-formed fears. Just as I began to drift off, a soft sound stirred me from the edge of slumber. It was subtle at first, barely more than a whisper, but it gradually grew more distinct, a rhythmic creaking, like the steady tread of footsteps pacing back and forth. The sound seemed to emanate from the living room below. I sat up, every nerve ending tingling with apprehension. The house was shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains. Summoning my courage, I slipped out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, easing it open with painstaking care to avoid making any noise. The hallway stretched before me, a yawning chasm of shadows and silence. I took a tentative step forward, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet. As I descended the staircase, the creaking ceased abruptly, plunging the house into an oppressive silence. I reached the bottom step and peered into the living room. The spindle remained on the mantelpiece, motionless and inert. Everything appeared as it should be, yet an undeniable sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I scanned the room, my eyes searching for any sign of movement, but found nothing. With a deep, shuddering breath, I convinced myself it was merely my imagination playing tricks on me and returned to bed. The following day, I resolved to remove the spindle from the house entirely. Evelyn had mentioned that destroying the anchor could potentially free the spirit, allowing it to move on. I retrieved the spindle from the mantel and carried it out to the backyard, where I had prepared a small fire pit. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn as I placed the spindle atop the kindling and struck a match. The flames licked hungrily at the dry wood, consuming it with a crackling fervor. I watched intently as the spindle blackened and charred, the intricate carvings obscured by soot and ash. As the fire reduced it to a smoldering pile of embers, a sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of burning fabric. I glanced around, but the trees stood still, their leaves unruffled. A chill ran down my spine as I realized there was no natural source for the breeze. That night, the rustling returned with a vengeance. It began as a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, but quickly escalated into a cacophony of sound. The noise seemed to come from all around me, an overwhelming symphony of fabric sliding, twisting, and nodding. I sat frozen in my armchair, paralyzed by fear, as the curtains billowed and swayed despite the closed windows. The air grew thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a tangible weight. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rustling ceased, leaving behind a suffocating silence. In the aftermath, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The walls, once adorned with the faded remnants of outdated wallpaper, were now bare, the paper stripped away to reveal the raw plaster beneath. The floor was littered with shreds of fabric and paper, as if some unseen force had torn them down in a fit of rage. I realized with dawning horror that the house itself was unraveling, the very threads of its existence coming undone. Desperation drove me to seek out Mr. Ellis, the local historian who had first told me of the weaver's tragic tale. I found him in his cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of dusty tomes and yellowed manuscripts. When I recounted the recent events, his expression grew grave. It seems, he began slowly, choosing his words with care, that the weaver's spirit is more deeply entwined with the fabric of your home than we initially believed. Destroying the spindle may have severed one connection, but it appears to have only agitated the spirit further. What can I do? I asked. My Mr. Ellis's office had gone quiet after I asked him what to do. He didn't look at me, just stared at the books lining his shelves, his expression grim. A small desk fan stirred the stagnant summer air, but the room felt oddly still, as if even the wind had chosen not to disturb the weight of what hung between us. I think, he said finally, it may not just be the spindle or the house. If what you've described is accurate, then the spirit is now bound to you. My mouth went dry. Bound? How do you mean? Like a needle pushed through fabric? He interrupted, his voice low. You were the one who found the weaver's spindle. You handled it. You brought it home. You burned it. The house was once a vessel. Now, you are the cloth. The silence between us after that was unbearable. Even the ticking clock on his wall seemed distant, muffled, like sound was folding in on itself. I stood, numb, and thanked him, not knowing why. That night, I dreamed of the house unraveling. Not just wallpaper or paint, but walls, floors, flesh. I stood in the center of it all, thread winding around my limbs, crawling into my mouth, pulling out words that didn't belong to me. I woke in a sweat, tangled in my bed sheets, the unmistakable sound of rustling echoing in my ears. Only this time, it wasn't just in my ears. The rustling came from my bedroom closet. I stared at it in the dark for what must have been an hour. The door creaked ever so slightly, swaying open just enough to reveal blackness. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I try not to breathe. But then something inside the closet shifted. Not loudly, just the faintest suggestion of cloth brushing against cloth. I got up and left the room. I slept in the guest bedroom that night, if you could call it sleep. The next day, I went back to Evelyn. She wasn't surprised to see me. "You should never have burned the spindle," she said before I even sat down. "That was rash. You told me it was an anchor." "Yes," she said carefully, "but not a cage. Spirits don't all want release. Some only want remembrance." She wasn't done weaving, and you scattered her final thread. I told her everything, the dreams, the peeling wallpaper, the way cloth seemed to move even when there was no breeze. I told her about the closet. Evelyn grew pale. "Did you ever remove anything else from that house? Any fabric, clothing, old blankets?" "No, just the spindle." She was quiet, and then, almost to herself, she muttered, then she wove into you. My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "She marked you. Your presence. Your body. She's finishing her work using you." At first I didn't believe her. But things grew worse at home. The floorboards no longer creaked, they moaned, as if something heavy dragged across them. My clothing smelled like old wool, like mildew and rot. I started finding threads on the floor. Long, delicate threads that trail like veins. They led into rooms, into walls, under furniture. Sometimes they pulsed when I touched them, like they were alive. Worse still, I began seeing faces in the fabric. In curtains, towels, even the fibers of the rug. Always distorted, like cloth too tightly stretched over something trying to scream. I try not to sleep, but every night I would drift off against my will and wake tangled in cloth that hadn't been there when I lay down. One morning I awoke unable to move, my arms bound to my sides by layers of what looked like linen. When I ripped it away, it turned to dust. That same gray dust that had started to appear in the corners of every room. Dust with no ceiling. Dust that fell like ash, though nothing burned. I became obsessed with a weaver. I went to the town library, the historical society, even visited the ruins of the old textile mill at the edge of town. No one remembered her real name. Only fragments remained. A woman who lost her child, who lived alone at the edge of town, who went mad weaving dresses that were never worn. Ellis called her the widow of thread. Some say she weaved to forget. Others said she weaved to remember. But the worst stories, he hesitated. They say she weaved to bring her daughter back. Using hair, bone, skin. I stared at him. That's insane. He didn't disagree. Back home, the house was no longer safe. The mirrors started warping. I saw myself moving when I was still. There were patterns appearing on the walls, stitched in dust and shadow. Symbols I didn't recognize. Some looked like eyes. Others, like mouths. I tried to leave. The front door would not open. Not jammed. Not locked. It was like the fabric of the house had sealed shut. I broke a window. The glass shattered fine, but beyond it was only more wall. Brick that hadn't been there before. Seamless. I was trapped. Sewn in. That night, I heard the loom again. The sound of it. Not a metaphor. Not in my head. A real wooden loom. Click. Pull. Tap. Click. Pull. Tap. The rhythm never changed. I followed the sound because of course I did. It came from the attic. I hadn't been up there since I moved in. The stairs groaned as I climbed them, but not under my weight. They groaned like they didn't want me there. When I opened the attic door, I nearly fell backward. The loom was real, wooden, primitive, covered in cloth that shimmered and moved like skin. It wove without hands. Shuttles moved on their own. Threads stretched taut between beams that shouldn't have supported them. And in the cloth being woven, faces. Mine, Evelyn's, Ellis's, people I'd passed on the street, all etched in fiber. The last thing I remember before blacking out was a whisper. Close. Personal. Just behind my ear. Almost done. I don't know how long I was unconscious. But when I woke up, my arms were bleeding. Thin red cuts crisscrossed them, as if someone had dragged fine thread over my skin until it sliced. My mouth was dry. My teeth felt like they were loose. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a whisper. The same whisper the cloth made when it moved. Evelyn came the next day. I hadn't called her. I hadn't done anything. She just knew. When she entered the house, she gasped. Dust swirled everywhere, as if the air was made of it. Threads hung like spider webs from the ceiling. Her eyes went to my arms, the cuts, the bruises, the shivering. She's almost finished, Evelyn said softly. What is she making? I croaked. She's weaving a replacement. For her daughter. You're the base cloth. I want to vomit. I tried. Nothing came up but dust. Evelyn knelt and whispered something I didn't hear. The air shifted. For a moment, the threads in the room tightened, as if listening, and then loosened again. She stood and looked at me, her expression full of pity. There's one way to stop her, she said, but it's cruel. You have to burn the final weave. And that loom is ancient. It won't go easy. How do I? But Evelyn was already leaving. Her last words chilled me. She doesn't want a house. She doesn't want a memory. She wants a body. And if you don't end this soon, she'll finish you. Evelyn's words echoed in my mind long after she left. She doesn't want a house. She doesn't want a memory. She wants a body. And if you don't end this soon, she'll finish you. The weight of that realization settled heavily upon me. The weaver's spirit wasn't merely haunting me. She was attempting to become me. The boundaries between our existences were fraying, threads intertwining in a tapestry of horror. Determined to confront this malevolent force, I knew I had to return to the attic, to the loom. The very thought sent shivers down my spine, but there was no alternative. I couldn't allow the weaver to complete her sinister masterpiece. Armed with a canister of kerosene and a box of matches, I ascended the creaking staircase, each step resonating with impending dread. The attic door stood ajar, as if inviting me into its shadowy depths. The air was thick with the scent of aged fabric and something more pungent, decay. Moonlight filtered through the grime-coated window, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. At the center of the room sat the loom, its wooden frame appearing more grotesque than before, as if it had aged centuries in mere days. The cloth on the loom had grown. It now cascaded onto the floor, a river of woven nightmares. Faces contorted in silent screams emerged from the fabric, their eyes pleading for release. Among them, I recognized Evelyn, Mr. Ellis, and countless others whose fates were unknown to me. The realization struck me like a physical blow. The weaver was trapping souls within her creation, each thread a lifeline severed. Summoning every ounce of courage, I approached the loom. The air grew colder with each step, my breath visible in the dim light. As I reached out to touch the cloth, a surge of energy coursed through me, and the room spun violently. When my vision cleared, I was no longer in the attic. I stood in a vast, desolate landscape, the ground beneath me a patchwork of tattered fabric stretching endlessly in all directions. The sky was a void of swirling gray, threads unraveling and reweaving in an eternal dance. In the distance, the silhouette of a woman hunched over a massive loom dominated the horizon. Her fingers moved with inhuman speed, weaving and intertwining threads that shimmered with an eerie light. Approaching cautiously, I called out, "Who are you?" The figure paused, slowly turning to face me. Her face was obscured by a veil of translucent fabric, but her eyes burned with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. "I am the Weaver," she intoned, her voice a symphony of whispers. "I craft the tapestry of existence, intertwining the threads of life and death." "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, finding strength in my fear. "I seek to mend what was torn," she replied, sorrow lacing her words. "My child was taken from me, her thread severed prematurely. Through my weaving, I aim to restore her, to bring her back into the fabric of reality." Understanding dawned upon me. Her grief had driven her to manipulate the very threads of existence, ensnaring souls in a futile attempt to resurrect her lost child. "But this isn't the way," I implored. "You're causing more pain, trapping innocent souls. You must let them go." The Weaver's eyes flickered with conflict. I cannot," she whispered. "Without them, the tapestry remains incomplete. My child remains lost." Realizing words alone wouldn't suffice, I knew I had to act. Focusing my will, I envisioned the threads unraveling, the trapped souls breaking free. The landscape responded to my intent, the fabric beneath me beginning to fray and dissolve. The Weaver screamed, a sound that resonated through the void, shaking the very foundations of this surreal realm. She lunged toward me, but I stood my ground. "Release them," I commanded, pouring every ounce of determination into my words. The threads around us quivered, and one by one, the faces began to fade from the cloth, their expressions shifting from anguish to peace. The Weaver fell to her knees, sobbing. "What have you done?" she cried. "I've set them free," I said gently. "And now it's time for you to find peace as well." She looked up at me, her veil slipping to reveal a face etched with sorrow and longing. With a nod, she whispered, "Thank you." Her form began to dissolve, threads unraveling and ascending into the void. The landscape around me disintegrated, and I felt myself being pulled back into reality. Gasping, I found myself once more in the attic, the loom now a pile of splintered wood and tattered fabric. The house felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The oppressive atmosphere had dissipated, replaced by a serene stillness. I descended the stairs, each step affirming that the nightmare had ended. In the days that followed, I reached out to Evelyn and Mr. Ellis.